Think about the term Dark Age. It conjures an image of a benighted time, cities in ruins, knowledge forgotten, art and progress stalled under the weight of barbarian rule. We imagine a 1,000-year night between the brilliance of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance. But what if that popular image is wrong? What if those centuries were not as dark as we've been led to believe? Consider a few snapshots from this era. In 537, the colossal dome of the Hagia Sophia was completed in Constantinople, seemingly to float suspended from heaven on a golden chain, as one historian, Procopius, described it, obviously awestruck. And around the same time, in the far west, an educated Roman named Boethius, imprisoned by a Gothic king, composed the Consolation of Philosophy, a profound work fusing classical wisdom with Christian thought. Jump ahead to the late 8th century. The Anglo-Saxon monk Bede teaches that the earth is round, and Charlemagne, the Frankish king, is crowned emperor in Rome on Christmas Day 800, reviving the idea of a Western empire and spurring a renaissance of learning in his lands. And in a monastery off the coast of Ireland, don't forget about those scribes illuminating the Book of Kells, a gospel manuscript of dazzling complexity and beauty. Those are just a few examples that hardly paint a picture of a dark world. They hint at a more vibrant and dynamic age. So why then do we call it the Dark Ages? Well, the term itself was coined long after the fact, famously by the Italian scholar Petrarch in the 14th century, to scorn the post-Roman centuries as an age of darkness between the enlightened ancient world and Petrarch's own time. And Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers certainly amplified that idea, biased towards the glories of Greece and Rome, and dismissive of medieval achievements. You see, to them, it was just a murky interlude when no great leaders emerged. No art, no science was worth mentioning. And this label stuck in the popular imagination. But with modern scholarship, we can dismantle that myth. And so today, we will explore how Western Europe and the Byzantine East between the 5th and 10th centuries were actually a time of growth, preservation, and innovation. And we'll talk about how the knowledge and culture survived and even thrived in monasteries and courts, how many new forms of art and literature blossomed, and how law and order were re-established by barbarian kingdoms and the church. Of course, technology, agricultural advances, all those little things that quietly improved life. And I think by the end, we'll certainly light up this dark age, and you'll know it's a time much brighter than its reputation suggests. But before we flick the switch on that, let me welcome you to the channel. It is once again a pleasure to welcome you, and if you're new or have yet to click the subscribe button, well, why don't you just do it? If you feel inclined to, of course. Also, a like and a comment certainly helps the algorithm out so more people can enjoy the content. And speaking of enjoying the content, you can enjoy it 100% uninterrupted right here on YouTube. You won't have any pesky mid-rolls. That's because we're supported by the generous people on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through Super Thanks or PayPal, and those who checked out the merch store for all its little goodies. So enjoy this all uninterrupted because of those fine people, and if you want to join that prestigious group, you need only navigate yourself to the pinned comment, video description, or channel description. Now, with that being said, let's get to the topic at hand. Well, first, it's pretty important to tackle the myth head on. You see, the notion of the Dark Ages implies a sharp break. That with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, civilization itself nearly collapsed in Western Europe, plunging into ignorance and chaos. And certainly the fall of Rome was a tumultuous process. Let's not deny that. The empire fragmented into various Germanic kingdoms. Cities like Rome and Trier shrank. Long-distance trade diminished. And warfare, that was frequent. There were certainly real hardships. Certainly we're not arguing that the Dark Age was a golden age. We're not romanticizing it that much, that's for sure. But neither was it a civilizational void. Many aspects of Roman culture, law and knowledge, continued or transformed rather than vanished. The very people decried as barbarians often aspired to Roman ideals themselves. For instance, let's take the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who, if you're not familiar with him, ruled Italy in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Well, he maintained Roman administrative systems and infrastructure. He kept learned Romans like Cassiodorus as advisors too. Cassiodorus later founded a monastery, Vivarium, devoted to preserving Roman and Christian texts, an early example of how the torch of learning was kept lit. Now, in Gaul, which is modern-day France, the 6th century historian Gregory of Tours could still write a detailed history of the Franks in Latin, showing that the habit of recording history endured even under Frankish kings. He wrote about wars and miracles with a more simple Latin style, true. But the very act of writing history, well, that was a continuation of classical tradition. Likewise, let's look at the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman world. It did not fall in 476, but rather it thrived. Byzantium preserved a direct continuation of Roman statehood, law, and urban life throughout the period. When later scholars called these centuries dark, they often ignored the Eastern Roman Empire entirely. In reality, when Rome fell in the west, Constantinople was still a beacon of wealth and learning, a city of light, and quite literally too, its streets illuminated at night by torches, its scholars studying ancient Greek texts that would have been lost to the West for centuries. And so that very term, Dark Ages, well, it's a little misleading, because much of the world at that time, the Byzantine East, the Islamic world in the 7th century, was experiencing anything but darkness. And even in the post-Roman West, there were rays of light that never ceased. I suppose anything is a dark age if the room that you're trapped in has the lights off. But it's also worth noting that historians originally used dark partly because of the scarcity of written sources for some early medieval periods, which made those times dark to our understanding. But archaeological discoveries in the last centuries have certainly shone light on those gaps, revealing continued trade networks, productive farms, and craftsmanship. The more we learn, the less dark the early Middle Ages appear. Modern historians now often avoid the term entirely, or use it only for very limited contexts. The consensus is that while the early medieval period had its challenges, it was a time of transformation and adaptation, certainly not a long night of barbarism. So, as we've done in this first section, we've rather dispelled the simplistic myth and naming conventions. So now let's look at the more positive developments of the era. How exactly did knowledge survive? And what new cultural achievements arose? How was order maintained and improved? Good questions. So let's begin with the realm of learning and literature, the life of the mind in an age of faith. Of course, One of the most crucial achievements of the early Middle Ages was the preservation and cultivation of knowledge. Even as the Western Roman political structure crumbled, education and literacy was a little bit harder to vanish overnight. They found new guardians, chiefly the Christian church and the monastic movement. Monasteries became the libraries and universities of the age. The clerics, the teachers, the scholars, all in one. Now consider monasticism, which spread through Europe, Western Europe rather, from the 6th century onward, and the pivotal figure here is Saint Benedict of Nursia, who around 530 wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict. Now this rule provided guidelines for monastic life. It emphasized prayer, work, study. Benedict's monasteries, like his famous Monte Cassino in Italy, required monks to read and copy text as part of their daily routine. Benedictine monasticism soon took root across Europe. In Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and wherever the monks went, the books went with them. Quiet scriptoria, that is, writing rooms, in these monasteries became workshops of learning, where scribes laboriously copied the Bible, theological treatises, but also many secular Latin works from antiquity. Ever wonder why we still can enjoy Plato, Aristotle, all that sort of stuff? Well, you've got them to thank. Watch my video on Irish monks if you want to know more about that. Of course, thanks to these patient monks, a great deal of classical literature survived. Virtually all the Latin works of authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid as well, that we have today exist because some early medieval copyist preserved them. In the so-called Dark Ages, that torch of knowledge was certainly not extinguished, but rather being carefully tended to by those, monks in monastic libraries. An outstanding example of scholarship in this period is the Northumbrian monk Bede, often called the Venerable Bede, who lived in the 7th to 8th centuries. Bede spent his entire life in the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow in northern England, yet his intellectual influence was wide-ranging. He mastered all available liberal arts learning of his time, from the scripture and history to grammar and science. Bede's most famous work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, is a monumental history that not only chronicles early English history, but demonstrates rigorous use of sources and dating methods. Bede helped establish the BC AD system of dating events by calculating years from the birth of Christ. He gave Europe a unified Christian chronology that replaced the old Roman calendar. Well, this is an intellectual innovation that's often overlooked, but it, of course, has had lasting impact on how our history is recorded. And in the realm of science and education, Bede also shatters the myth of medieval ignorance. In his treatise, On the Reckoning of Time, he explained the spherical shape of the earth and the causes of unequal length of days throughout the year. The earth, Bede taught, is round like a ball, not flat like a shield. Clear evidence that educated people of the early Middle Ages understood the basic astronomy inherited from the Greeks. He also described the tides and their relation to the phases of the moon with admittedly impressive accuracy. Bede and scholars like him were inheritors of classical scientific tradition. Far from believing in a flat earth or shunning reason, early medieval scholars integrated classical knowledge with Christian thought to the best of their ability. Well, elsewhere in Europe, we find similar beacons of learning. In what is now Spain, Isidore of Seville, a 7th century bishop, compiled an entire encyclopedia of knowledge called the Etymologies. Isidore tried to summarize all human knowledge, from theology and natural science to medicine and grammar, preserving many fragments of classical learning in the process. His work became a standard reference for centuries. In fact, the very idea of an encyclopedia of universal knowledge in the early 600s shows the intellectual curiosity that survived the fall of Rome. Education also received attention from kings. A landmark effort was the Carolingian Renaissance in the late 8th and 9th centuries. The Frankish king, later Emperor Charlemagne, was not content to rule over an illiterate populace. Though he himself may have only been semi-literate, there is a famous anecdote from his biographer Einhard that Charlemagne kept writing tablets under his pillow to practice writing in secret. He deeply valued learning and recognized its importance for governance and religion. In 789, Charlemagne issued an edict called the Admonitio Generalis that, among many other reforms, ordered the establishment of schools at monasteries and cathedrals throughout his realm. Now, these schools were to educate boys in reading, writing, music, and scripture, essentially creating an educated clergy and an administrative class. An early push for universal education. Well, limited to males and within a church context, but I said it was early, right? Well, Charlemagne also gathered the greatest scholars of his age at his palace court in Aachen. He brought Alcuin of York from England to head his palace school. And speaking of Alcuin, he was a brilliant teacher who helped standardize curricula and produce corrected editions of texts. Other luminaries, like the historian Paul the Deacon from Italy and theologian Theodulf from Spain, were also invited to join the court. And together they pored over ancient manuscripts, correcting errors that had crept in over centuries of copying. And they produced new works of theology, poetry, and scholarship. Out of this circle came innovations such as the development of Carolingian minuscule, a clear, new handwriting style that made reading and copying far easier. The script with its neat lowercase letters is the ancestor of fonts that we actually use today. Well, it's also no exaggeration to say that hundreds of manuscripts, both biblical and classical text, were copied in the Carolingian scriptoria, effectively renewing Europe's textual resources. Without this Carolingian push, many works might have just disappeared. Even in areas outside of direct Carolingian influence, learning quietly persisted. In Ireland and Scotland, monasteries not only preserved Latin learning, but also fostered vernacular literacy. The earliest writings in Old Irish date from this period, showing a scholarly culture in the Celtic world. Irish and Scottish monks travelled as missionaries and teachers to the continent. Figures like Columbanus in the 6th centuries, for example, who founded monasteries in Gaul and Italy, bringing Irish learning with them. And by the 9th century, England's King Alfred the Great, another rare example of a, quote, educated king, was lamenting the decline of Latin education in his land. And instead of just doing nothing, he actually took action by having important books translated from Latin into Old English, so that all freeborn youth in England could learn to read English and know its basic knowledge. Alfred personally participated in translating works like Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into English of his day. Of course, it's not the English that we have these days, but really the English we have now is not really English, but that's a story for another video. In any case, this is arguably, and this is important, the first state-sponsored literacy campaign in English history. Now, efforts like that indicate far from being complacent in ignorance. Early medieval leaders and churchmen were actively trying to improve learning, and saw it as vital to spiritual but also societal health. Well, let's turn to culture, because that was not a barren field in the Dark Ages either. It simply just took new forms. Art and literature continued to be produced, often with a distinctive early medieval flair that blended Christian, Roman, and, of course, those new barbarian influences. But if one only looks at the gleaming ruins of classical statues or the monumental architecture of Rome, you might think that art had declined. But look a little closer. What was created between the 5th and the 10th centuries, and you'll find masterpieces and innovation that rival anything that preceded them. Well, let's start with literature and language. Far from a period of silence, the early medieval centuries gave us epic poetry, saints' lives, sagas, and more. In Anglo-Saxon England, the epic Beowulf was composed likely between the 8th and early 9th century. Now, this is a magnificent poem. Though written in Old English rather than Latin, it stands as one of the great literary achievements of medieval Europe, rich in symbolism and artistry. Likewise, early medieval Celtic culture produced wonders like the Mabinogion tales in Wales and the saga of Cormac in Ireland. In continental Europe, Latin literature continued with writers like Venantius Fortunatus, that is the 6th century poet and bishop who wrote both hymns and secular poetry, and later with figures like Walafrid Strabo, a 9th century monk who wrote an influential theological epic. Religious literature also abounded. Biographies of saints, which are called hagiographies, circulated widely, providing more inspiration and also, incidentally, preserving historical details of the times. For instance, The Life of St. Columba by Adomnan, written around 700 in Iona, gives fascinating glimpses of early medieval Scottish society while recounting the miracles of a beloved abbot. Far from being culturally stagnant, people were telling stories, writing poems, and documenting events, sometimes in Latin or sometimes in the emerging vernacular languages. In any case, it only serves to enrich Europe's literary heritage. Now, moving on to visual arts, there was an explosion in intricate and small-scale artwork that often gets less attention compared to those grand Roman sculptures, but it is certainly just as impressive in skill. The migration-era barbarian kingdoms produced gorgeous metalwork, jewelry, weapon hilts, belt buckles, other adornments, inlaid with gold and garnet in swirling patterns not seen before. Now let's look at the famous example that is the Sutton Hoo treasure from the early 7th century in England. A royal burial hoard that contained a stunning helmet and exquisite wrought jewelry, combining Anglo-Saxon and Mediterranean motifs. These garnets in these pieces, by the way, likely came all the way from India or Sri Lanka, and that demonstrates trade links, and a little more on trade later. The point here is that an aesthetic of fine detail and interlaced pattern developed, especially in Celtic and Germanic art, which is anything but primitive. And indeed, one of the crown jewels of the early medieval culture is the illuminated manuscript. Monks and scribes turned holy books into works of art by embellishing them with colorful inks, gold leaf, and elaborate illustrations. The Book of Kells, created around 800 in Celtic Britain or Ireland, is often regarded as the peak of illuminated manuscripts. Its pages teem with vibrant knotwork designs and iconography, so detailed that even with modern magnification we marvel at the craftsmanship. Similarly, the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Durrow, from circa 700 Northumbria and 650 Ireland respectively, showcase the fusion of Christian imagery with intricate Celtic patterns. These are not the products of a culturally dark era. They are rather brilliant achievements that required both technical skill and aesthetic imagination. Such manuscripts were luxury items, usually intended for display on altars or use by high clergy, signaling the importance placed on art in the service of religion. And of course, beyond their mere aesthetic beauty, they often preserved the text of the Gospels and other writings, marrying artistic and intellectual preservation into one. But architecture, too, that quietly advanced. While it is true that early medieval Western Europe did not immediately produce buildings on the scale of the Roman Colosseum or the Pantheon, it was far from an age without construction. Churches and monasteries were built everywhere, often repurposing Roman stones or columns, but also developing new styles. Of course, a notable example of that is the 7th century Basilica of St. Apollinar in Classe in Ravenna, then a center of Byzantine influence in Italy, adorned with resplendent mosaics that testified to the continuation of high-quality art. In the Frankish realm, by Charlemagne's time, we see an ambition to build in grand style again. Charlemagne's palace chapel at Aachen, completed around 805, featured a domed octagonal church inspired by Byzantine architecture. And indeed, he imported marble, and columns from Italy, and hired Lombard masons to realize the dream. This Carolingian architecture is a precursor to the later Romanesque style, and shows that the desire for monumental building was very much alive. But even earlier, small but elegant churches like San Juan de Baños in Visigothic Spain, built around 661, or even St. Peter's Church in Wearmouth, England, built around 675 under Abbot Benedict Biscop, who imported glass from Gaul for the windows, illustrate that building techniques and artistry continued. In Anglo-Saxon England, timber halls and churches were common early on, but by the 8th century, stone construction became more frequent, indicating growing resources and skills. The Byzantine Empire, on the other hand, never stopped building. We mention Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the great domed cathedral finished under Emperor Justinian. And that dome, 102 feet across and hovering 180 feet above the floor, was an engineering feat that pushed the boundaries of architecture. It remained the largest church in the world for nearly 1,000 years. The Byzantines also excelled in mosaic art. The golden mosaics of Ravenna in Italy, and later of Thessaloniki and Constantinople itself, show a continuity of Greco-Roman artistic realism blended with a new, transcendent Christian style. Icon painting, that is, holy images of Christ, Mary, and the saints, became a major art form in this era, despite the little hiccup of the iconoclast controversy in the 8th and 9th centuries. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a religious conflict over the use of images, and that led to the destruction of many early icons. In any case, by the later 9th century, icons were reinstated and produced in massive numbers. These icons and mosaics are visually stunning, rich with symbolism, and they deeply influenced the spiritual life of medieval people. The artistry involved, mixing pigments, gilding halos, capturing expressive faces. It shows a sophisticated cultural milieu, certainly not a dark one. But another cultural pillar of the age was the Christian church itself, which grew to be the unifying institution across Western Europe, pretty much the one-stop shop for everything. The early medieval period was actually an era of massive religious expansion and organization. Pagan tribes in Europe converted to Christianity one by one, and with each new conversion came a whole new cultural package: literacy to read scripture, Latin language for the liturgy, and often church laws and moral codes that reshaped societies. For example, when the Frankish king Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity around 496, it aligned the new Frankish kingdom with the Roman Church. Clovis and his successors issued law codes that, while still quite rough by modern standards, aimed to regulate violence through fines and legal processes rather than blood feuds. The Church held synods and councils that set social norms. For instance, numerous church councils in Gaul and Spain in the 6th and 7th centuries took measures to protect the weak, regulate marriages, and curb abuse. Small steps toward more orderly communities. The concept of morality and order rooted in Christian teaching slowly permeated the new kingdoms and acted as a brand new civilizing force. But monasteries and churches also acted as cultural centers, not only for learning, as mentioned, but for music and liturgy. The development of Gregorian chant, for instance, occurred in the early medieval church. By the 9th century, the Frankish and Roman traditions of plainchant merged into what had become the standard liturgical music of the Middle Ages. This musical innovation, preserved in manuscripts with some of the earliest musical notation, is a testament to that era's cultural creativity. And it's quite nice to listen to those sorts of chants. If I want to recommend anyone, I would recommend Divna Ljubojevic. I think that's how I pronounce it. Absolutely fantastic. Great to listen to, especially when you're just relaxing, meditating, whatever it is. So here's another important area of growth in the early Middle Ages, and that is the re-establishment of political order and legal structures after the Western Roman Empire fell. The narrative of chaos and lawlessness after Rome is a little bit exaggerated. In fact, new kingdoms arose that, while different from the imperial system, created their own forms of stability and continuity. Various Germanic kingdoms, let's get to them first. Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul, Ostrogoths, and then the Lombards in Italy, Anglo-Saxons in Britain, among others, carved out their own territories. Initially there were power struggles and shifting borders, yes, but by the late 5th and 6th centuries, many of these realms had settled into relative stability. I say relative stability for the Middle Ages, of course. These kings did something crucial. They issued written law codes, often in Latin, for their realms. And this shows an active effort to govern justly and record rules, much like the Roman tradition of law. For instance, the Visigothic Code, also known as Lex Visigothorum, was compiled in the 7th century in the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain. It was a comprehensive set of laws that applied to both the Visigothic nobles and the Roman population under their rule, covering everything from property rights to marriage and crime. And notably, it outlawed marriage between close relatives and set penalties for various offenses, clearly an attempt at civil society norms. In the Frankish realms, which would become France and Germany, King Clovis and his successors put forward the Salic law in the early 6th century, as mentioned, and later kings added to it. Now, the Salic law was famous for its detailed schedule of fines for all sorts of injuries. This was a move to replace cycles of revenge with structured compensation. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxon kings in England released some of their earliest law codes in the vernacular, and the earliest known, by King Ethelbert of Kent around 602, lists fines for crimes and protections for the church. It was written in Old English, the Anglo-Saxon vernacular, making it actually the earliest Germanic language law code that we have. These legal texts, dry as they may seem, are evidence of societies striving for order, justice, and continuity with Roman legal habits, and they also indicate rising administrative capability. Kings had scribes compile and copy these laws, courts to enforce them, and they were promulgated to the people. But as time went on, larger polities formed. The Frankish kingdom expanded, and by the 8th and 9th centuries under the Carolingians had become a new empire covering much of Western and Central Europe. Charlemagne's empire, known of course as the Carolingian Empire, wasn't just about brute force and violence. It had a very strong administrative backbone. Charlemagne sent out royal agents called missi dominici to oversee local authorities, hold general assemblies, and standardize weights and measures. He and his son, Louis the Pious, also enacted many capitularies, that is, royal decrees, to legislate on everything from church reform to the control of taverns to the mismanagement of royal lands. and this indicates a governing mindset at work, a conscious effort to impose a higher order on the patchwork of local customs. It is a direct contradiction to the idea of that anarchic dark age. For example, the Admonitio Generalis of 789 mentioned earlier in the education section also contained provisions for the moral reform of society, urging clergy to lead by example, insisting that Sundays must be respected, that the poor and strangers be protected, and that judges dispense justice without bribes. Well, another vital aspect of the stability was indeed the role of the Church as a unifying institution across different kingdoms. Bishops and abbots often functioned as mediators and administrators, helping to fill the void left by Roman bureaucracy. The Church also provided a moral framework that discouraged some of the worst violence. In the 10th century, slightly later than our core period, but building on earlier efforts, movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God arose, where bishops rallied communities to limit warfare, forbidding violence against non-combatants and prohibiting fighting on holy days. These movements, of course, had roots in earlier councils and decrees that sought to temper the endemic warfare of the nobility. The idea that even warfare should be subject to moral law was a medieval development, an attempt to civilize behavior through religious pressure. Now, socially, while the stratification of society into nobility, clergy, and peasants, etc., did continue, there were some improvements in how communities functioned. The early medieval period saw the birth or growth of many towns and market centers after an initial post-Roman dip. For example, archaeological evidence shows that by the 8th and 9th century, trading towns like Dorestad in Frisia, which is modern-day Netherlands, and Rouen and Kantovik in northern France, and then we got London in England too. They all became thriving trading hubs. They weren't as large as the big Roman cities, but they were bustling enough to attract merchants from far away. Law codes from the era often dedicate sections to commercial matters, implying active trade, like rules on coinage, weights and measures, this kind of thing. Over time, these small market towns laid the groundwork for the later revival of urban life in the High Middle Ages. But it's also during this period that we see the embryonic form of parliaments or councils in some regions. The kings would hold diets or assemblies. For instance, the early English assembly of the wise men, the Wittenagemot, advised Anglo-Saxon kings, and the Frankish kings held annual Champs de Mars, that is, March fields, where nobles and churchmen discussed affairs. They weren't really democratic by any modern standard, but they established the idea that rulers should at least consult with leading representatives of the realm, a precedent for more formal parliaments in later centuries. So in short, the early medieval West was actively rebuilding political structures. It moved from the unitary empire of Rome to a more pluralistic order of kingdoms. But those kingdoms created laws, enforced justice, and maintained relative peace, especially once they converted to Christianity, which often curbed a little bit of the violence. Well, by the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe was not a lawless wasteland at all. It was a patchwork of states with functioning institutions. Charlemagne's imperial title in 800 signified not the end of darkness, but rather the recognition that the work of statecraft had achieved a new height. A Western European ruler deemed himself, with the Pope's blessing nonetheless, the successor to the Roman Caesars. That moment shows a psychological end to any notion of being in dark times, I think. Charlemagne and his circle certainly believed that they were living in an age of renewal and light. He actively fostered the idea of a renovatio Romani Imperi, that is, renewal of the Roman Empire. I suppose one could argue that the concept of Europe as a distinct civilization coalesced in these early centuries, this fusion of Roman, Christian, and Germanic elements that forged in the aftermath of Rome's fall. Well, perhaps one of the most surprising aspects of this so-called Dark Age is the quiet technological and economic progress that was made. Let me explain. We do often assume that no scientific or technological advances happened until later, but early medieval people were innovative when necessity demanded it. Whether it was agriculture, warfare, just daily life, several improvements were introduced between the 5th and 10th centuries that would prove to be very, very important. Start with agriculture. Of course, that is the backbone of the economy, cannot deny that. As great centralized supply chains of the Roman Empire broke down, communities had to become more self-sufficient to get the most out of local lands. Farming is never easy, of course. This spurred agricultural innovation. One major development was the spread of the heavy plough in northern Europe. The Romans had used a light scratch plough that worked well in the light soils of the Mediterranean, but it was inadequate for the heavy, clay-rich soils of northern Gaul. Germany and England, too, had the same situation. Sometimes around the 7th to 8th centuries, a new type of plough with an iron ploughshare and a mould board emerged in Slavic lands and the eastern Frankish realms. This heavy, wheeled plough could turn over the dense soils and create furrows, significantly improving crop yields in northern climates. By the 9th and 10th centuries, this technology had spread widely in Europe, contributing to more efficient farming and supporting population growth. In conjunction, the use of the horse collar and horseshoe for plough animals, both innovations appearing by the early Middle Ages, allowed horses or oxen to pull ploughs more effectively without choking and work on rough terrain without injury. These may sound like humble inventions, but you must remember how enormous the impact was. More food produced with less labor meant communities could sustain more people and recover quickly from hardships. Another transformative agricultural practice was the three-field crop rotation system. The Romans typically used a two-field system. Plant one field, leave another fallow. Sometime around the 8th or 9th century, in parts of Frankish territories, farmers began dividing land into 3 parts. One planted in autumn with winter wheat or rye, one in spring with crops like barley or legumes, and one left fallow to recover. Now each year, the fields rotated. This method left only a third of land fallow at the time, instead of half as in the older system, and it also improved soil fertility by alternating deep-rooted and shallow-rooted plants, and including legumes that fixed nitrogen, whether they knew it or not. The result was certainly a noticeable increase in yield and a better diet variety. By the High Middle Ages, this three-field system was widespread and underpinned the population boom of that era, but its genesis lies in the early experiments of medieval times. In short, medieval peasants were not ignorant of how to improve their farming. They were actively trying new approaches, and they were getting better at it every year. Now consider mechanical technology. One might assume that without the Roman engineering corps, that technology regressed. Not so. Certain technology saw their first large-scale use in the early medieval period, and one prime example is the water mill. Water-powered mills for grinding grain existed in Roman times, but they became truly common in early medieval Europe. The collapse of slave-based agriculture made labor-saving devices attractive. By the 8th century, documents and archaeology show water mills along many rivers and streams. even in far-flung places like Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England. These mills freed people from hours of manual grinding and allowed larger quantities of flour to be produced, supporting the larger communities that would come with time. The Domesday Book, a survey of England in 1086, a little bit later than our period, found thousands of mills across even that relatively small country, many of which had been in operation since centuries before. The spread of the watermill is sometimes called the first industrial revolution in Europe, long before the 18th century one. Relatedly, the early Middle Ages also saw the introduction of the windmill by the 9th and 10th century in Persia, and soon after in Europe, although windmills became common in Europe a bit later. Other inventions improved the mechanical clock. The first mechanical clock appear in Europe by the late 13th century, but they drew on earlier timing devices like water clocks. Interestingly, a legendary early hint of mechanical ingenuity is the water-powered clock sent by Caliph of Baghdad to Charlemagne around 807. It allegedly wowed the Frankish court with its moving figures and chiming hours, showing that advanced technology was certainly being shared across certain cultures. Furthermore, eyeglasses would only be invented in the late 13th century, but the need for visual aids was recognized by scholars copying manuscripts in dim light. So, they used what was called reading stones, a kind of polished glass, as a precursor. And while these particular items fall just outside the traditional Dark Ages, once again, it has its roots in that ethos of medieval problem-solving. In terms of military technology, the early medieval era introduced the stirrup to European warfare, likely brought from Central Asia around the 7th to 8th century. The stirrup seemed simple, but it revolutionized cavalry by giving riders greater stability and the ability to use lances more effectively, paving the way for the emergence of medieval knights and heavy cavalry. Of course, this dramatically changed battle tactics and made cavalry the dominant force for centuries. A small innovation with a huge ramification. Of course, the knightly class and feudal cavalry obligations all tie back to the arrival of the stirrup. But let us not forget navigation and exploration. This period saw the remarkable expansion of the Vikings from the 8th to 10th centuries, who, despite their reputation as fearsome raiders, were also skilled sailors and traders. Viking longships were technological marvels of the time. Fast, durable, able to sail rivers and open sea. Using these ships, Norse mariners explored the North Atlantic, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson landed in Vinland, today's Newfoundland. This was an incredible navigational feat that predates Columbus by almost 500 years. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Vikings, or the Varangians, opened river routes to the Black Sea and Constantinople, integrating Northern Europe into the broader trade network. These exploits certainly required keen knowledge of star navigation, shipbuilding, and overall adaptation to new lands. Hardly the work of an unenlightened people, that's for sure. Now, economically, as we touched upon earlier, trade never died out. It just retracted and reconfigured. The early Middle Ages saw a shift from the huge interregional trade of the Roman Empire to more localized trade at first, but by the 7th century, international routes were re-emerging. The Silk Road still functioned through the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, bringing luxury goods to Europe. The Franks, for example, obtained silk from Byzantium and spices from the East. In fact, Charlemagne was known to gift silken cloaks, likely imported through the Italian ports. And on the other side, Europe exported raw materials like timber, furs, and slaves too, unfortunately, to more sophisticated economies in the East. Under the Carolingians, A silver coinage economy was revived. Charlemagne's monetary reforms established the silver denier as a standard coin, facilitating commerce. And coins minted in places like Anglo-Saxon England, Carolingian Gaul, and Viking Dublin. That's right, Dublin was a Viking city, show an interconnected economy. A fascinating find is a coin from the English King Offa of Mercia, late 8th century, that is an imitation of an Arabic gold dinar, complete with Arabic inscriptions, although likely without full understanding of them. Archaeology continuously provides vivid evidence of these networks. For instance, beads from as far as the Middle East have been found in 7th century graves in Scandinavia. Byzantine coins turn up in Mediterranean settings too. And all of this shows that goods were moving across long distances. The scale might have been smaller than in Roman times, certainly, but by the 9th and 10th centuries, trade was vigorous enough that some historians speak of a commercial rejuvenation, well before the famous high medieval economic revival. But no evaluation of the Dark Ages would be complete without highlighting the Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, which serves as a pretty good counterexample to the idea of a Dark Age. While Western Europe was rebuilding and redefining itself, Byzantium, as historians call the Eastern Empire, was a bastion of classical knowledge and a center of economic and cultural life. Focusing mainly on Western Europe often skews our perception when talking about this stuff, but Byzantium between the 5th and 10th centuries was often the richest and most advanced state in the Western Eurasian world. Even as the Western Empire fell in the 5th century, the East persisted. The Emperor Justinian I, who reigned 527 to 565, deserves a special mention. He embarked on ambitious projects that symbolically and practically kept Roman civilization very much alive. Under Justinian, Byzantium produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the comprehensive code of Roman law published in the 530s. This was effectively a compilation and clarification of a millennium of Roman legal thought, from the edicts of emperors to the opinions of jurists, and all organized into a coherent code. The Corpus Juris not only served Byzantium for centuries, but much later in the 11th century was rediscovered in the West and became the foundation for modern civil law traditions. That debt to the early medieval East is often forgotten. Our legal systems today in many countries owe a lineage to Justinian's codifiers, a monument of legal scholarship. Now, culturally, Constantinople was a powerhouse. It may well have been the largest city in the world around 600, with perhaps 500,000 people at its peak. It featured advanced urban amenities, hospitals, orphanages, public baths, some continued from Roman times, and a famous university, i.e. the University of Constantinople, that during this era maintained instruction in Greek literature, philosophy, medicine, and more. Classical education in rhetoric and philosophy persisted in the East longer than in the Latin West. Byzantines read Homer, Plato, and Aristotle in the original Greek. They wrote commentaries on those works and preserved them in their libraries. In the 9th and 10th centuries, during the so-called Macedonian Renaissance, named for the Macedonian dynasty of emperors, Byzantine scholars like Photius and Arethusa compiled encyclopedias and anthologies of ancient knowledge. Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century, famously wrote the Bibliotheca, a work summarizing and reviewing hundreds of books he had read, including many classical texts that are now lost except for his sole account of them. It's a shame. Well, it shows a lively intellectual culture, if anything. Now, the Byzantine Empire was also a center of art and learning that influenced its neighbors. Its magnificent art, icons, illuminated manuscript, silks embroidered with imperial motifs, was covered by coveted rather by foreign kings. The empire actively interacted with the new civilization of Islam and with the Slavic peoples to its north. For example, Byzantium played a key role in converting the Slavs to Christianity in the 9th century. The Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius developed the first Slavic alphabet, Glagolitic, which evolved into Cyrillic. That's where we get Cyrillic from Cyril. Well, they also translated the Bible into Old Slavonic. Of course, this was a huge cultural leap for the Slavs, and directly enabled the Byzantine initiatives, a light spreading outward. The Eastern Church and Empire thereby influenced what would become Russia, Bulgaria, and Serbia, pulling them into the orbit of the Greco-Roman Christian civilization. By the 10th century, Prince Olga of Kiev, and later her grandson Vladimir, adopted Christianity for Kievan Rus throughout the contact with Byzantium, profoundly shaping Eastern European history. Now, this transmission of religion, literacy, and art to the Slavs, is very much a story of the early Middle Ages, and is anything but a story of decline, but rather one of cultural enrichment. Well, all of this is to say that Byzantium was a continuous shining beacon of the post-classical world that kept many elements of the classical civilizations vibrant. When Western Europeans later journeyed to Constantinople, etc., during the First Crusade and the end of the 11th century, they were astonished by the city's size, wealth, and sophistication. It was beyond anything in the Latin West at the time. The Byzantines themselves certainly didn't view their age as dark. They considered themselves the true Romans and custodians of a great civilization. Of course, if you were to say, "Why are you living like this? Rome has fell," they would probably tell you, "What do you mean Rome's fell? We're right here." But moreover, Byzantine influence seeped back westward gradually. There were instances of scholarly exchange. For example, the 8th century Northumbrian scholar Bede corresponded with a bishop from the Byzantine-ruled south of Italy, receiving the knowledge of Greek hagiographies. The Carolingians sought alliances and marriage ties with Byzantium. One of Charlemagne's daughters was even proposed to a Byzantine prince, and later his grandsons intermarried with the Byzantine imperial family. While a full transmission of Greek learning to the West wouldn't happen until much later, Byzantium still served as a storehouse of knowledge that eventually would flow back. So when we discuss Renaissance in the 12th century, or, of course, the later Italian Renaissance, we often celebrate the rediscovery of the ancient Greek works. Many of those works had existed in Byzantine libraries until savvy Western or Arabic scholars obtained them. So during that so-called Dark Age, the East was holding in trust much of the heritage that the West had thought it had lost. So as we've seen, the Dark Ages were not really that dark, but they were rather just an age of initial transition and then transformation. Western Europe had a bit of a shock after Rome's collapse, but it gradually regenerated itself, preserving some of the old, innovating some of the new. Literacy and learning carried on, and everything just got into a new routine, I suppose. So, not quite dark at all. Certainly a little bit panicked after the fall of Rome, but hey, what are you going to do? In any case, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters now. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulvenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Gary, and Catty B. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone, that is it from me tonight. I hope you have enjoyed, and I hope I will see you next time. Lots of love to you all, and good night for now.